What if I told you that the most dangerous moment in a toxic relationship isn't during the abuse? It's when the victim tries to leave. Today, we're diving into one of the most calculated and devastating revenge attacks in British criminal history. A case so horrifying that seasoned detectives still struggle to discuss it, and so brutal that the images from this case were deemed so horrific that they've never been released to the public. This is the story of how jealousy transformed love into liquid hell, and how one woman's inability to accept rejection led to an act so evil that it would ultimately claim a life across international borders. The medical professionals who treated the victim described his injuries as beyond anything in their training or experience, and the legal system struggled to find adequate punishment for a crime that destroyed not just a life, but a soul. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this case haunts everyone who encountered it, why it changed laws across Europe, and why the name Berlinah Wallace has become synonymous with calculated cruelty in the annals of British crime. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. On the early morning of September 23, 2015, the tranquility of Bristol was brutally torn apart. Dr. Nick White, a resident of a quiet street, was jolted awake, not by an alarm, but by sounds that would forever echo in her memory. Desperate, agonizing screams pierced the pre-dawn air, mixed with the frantic, incessant ringing of her doorbell. Disoriented but alarmed, Dr. White stumbled to her window. What she peered through her curtains to witness was so horrific, so utterly unbelievable that her mind initially tried to process it as some kind of sick, macabre joke. Standing in the street, bathed in the dim glow of streetlights, was a man. He was wearing nothing but his underwear, his body exposed to the cool morning air. But what Dr. White initially mistook for mud, or some bizarre paint, covering his upper body and face, was something far, far more sinister. The man wasn't just screaming. He was howling in primal agony, his voice raw with terror and unimaginable pain. He was begging anyone who could hear him for help, his pleas echoing chillingly in the stillness of the residential street. As Dr. White watched, paralyzed by shock, the truth solidified into a terrifying reality. The substance covering his skin wasn't dirt. It was literally dissolving before her eyes, flesh peeling away in grotesque, horrifying chunks. Down the street, Thomas Sweet, another neighbor, had also been roused by the terrifying screams. His first thought was of an intruder, a violent attack underway. Grabbing a golf club, a makeshift weapon, he rushed outside, driven by an instinct to protect. But what he discovered defied all comprehension, all reason. The man's flesh wasn't merely burned, it was dissolving, sloughing off his body. It became immediately and chillingly clear. This wasn't some bizarre prank. No Halloween scare come early. This was a human being in the throes of one of the most brutal, calculated, and devastating attacks imaginable. The victim of this unfathomable violence was Mark van Dongen, a 29-year-old Dutch engineer. Like so many ambitious young people, Mark had moved to the UK with dreams of building a better life, a brighter future. He was intelligent, driven, and possessed a vibrant spirit. Friends universally described him as someone with an infectious smile, a genuine kindness that drew people to him, and an optimistic outlook on life. He was forging a successful career as an engineer, and by all accounts had everything going for him. But Mark's promising life had become tragically entangled with someone who would ultimately destroy everything he held dear, extinguishing his dreams and his very existence in an act of monstrous cruelty. Berlinah Wallace was 48 years old when she first met Mark van Dongen in 2010. Born in South Africa, Wallace was nearly 2 decades Mark's senior. The two embarked on a relationship that, according to Mark's closest friends, was toxic from its very inception. Wallace was studying fashion at the University of the West of England, a pursuit that seemed to mask a deeply troubled and controlling nature. Those closest to Mark began noticing disturbing patterns in their relationship almost immediately, red flags that waved fiercely, yet Mark seemed unable to escape their ensnaring grip. Mark's friends became increasingly concerned as they witnessed clear, undeniable signs of escalating abuse. They regularly saw mysterious scratches and bruises covering Mark's arms, torso, and sometimes his face, injuries that seemed to appear after he had spent time with Wallace. When questioned, Mark would offer vague or evasive explanations, clearly uncomfortable discussing the source of his injuries. In one particularly alarming and chilling incident, Wallace had poured boiling water on Mark while he slept, leaving him with significant burns. This horrifying act, a clear precursor to the violence to come, was dismissed by Mark as an accident, a drunken mistake. Yet, it was a terrifying preview of the depths of Wallace's capacity for cruelty. Despite these glaring red flags, despite the growing fear of his friends, Mark remained trapped in the relationship for 5 long years, ensnared in a suffocating cycle of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse that eroded his self-worth and ability to leave. By August 2015, after years of silent suffering, Mark van Dongen finally found the courage to break free. He had met someone new, a glimmer of hope and happiness in his shadowed life, and he was ready to start fresh, to reclaim his future. He desperately wanted to end the toxic cycle and build a healthy relationship. But breaking free from Berlinah Wallace, he would soon discover, would prove to be a decision that would not only cost him his new happiness, but nearly everything he held dear, ultimately culminating in the loss of his life. On September 2nd, 2015, a chillingly precise 21 days before the attack that would end Mark's life, Wallace's behavior escalated to a terrifying new level. Her actions were no longer spontaneous outbursts of rage. They were calculated, premeditated, and chillingly methodical. She spent hours glued to her computer, not studying fashion, but meticulously researching acid attacks. Her search history, later uncovered by police, revealed an obsessive deep dive into 82 different cases of acid violence. She researched the devastating, life-altering effects these attacks had on victims, almost as if she was crafting and planning the perfect method of revenge, a blueprint for destruction. That same day, with a terrifying calmness that belied the horror of her intentions, Wallace went online and ordered a 1-liter bottle of concentrated sulfuric acid from Amazon. The timing was far from coincidental. It was the very same day that Mark van Dongen, desperate for help, contacted the police, reporting that Wallace had been relentlessly harassing both him and his new girlfriend. Wallace would call Mark's new partner repeatedly, staying silent on the line in a calculated, insidious attempt to intimidate, terrorize, and isolate her. This was not a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated act of malice. During that same agonizing phone call to the police, Mark revealed something that truly underscored the depth of his despair and fear. He told officers that Wallace had been making increasingly disturbing threats, including promising to take her own life if he left her. A classic manipulative tactic often used by abusers to maintain control. But his fear wasn't just for her, it was for himself. Mark also called his father, Cornelius, affectionately known as Keys, that day. He confessed that he was genuinely terrified of what Wallace might do next. He recounted the relentless physical abuse, the chilling boiling water incident, and his growing, gnawing fear that Wallace was capable of even worse, far darker violence. He knew deep down that she was dangerous, but the cycle of abuse had left him vulnerable and unsure of how to truly escape. Despite every instinct, every warning from his friends and family, Mark made a decision that would tragically seal his fate. On the evening of September 22nd, 2015, he went to Wallace's flat one final time. Perhaps he sought closure, a peaceful resolution, a way to make it absolutely undeniably clear that their relationship was over. Perhaps he held a sliver of hope that they could part amicably, or at least without further incident. Tragically, against all odds, he decided to stay the night, a decision that would ultimately cost him everything. At approximately 3 a.m. on September 23rd, just hours after he had sought peace, Mark van Dongen lay sleeping peacefully in what he thought was safety. But his peace was an illusion. Wallace, with chilling resolve, quietly got out of bed. She walked silently to the kitchen, retrieved the concentrated sulfuric acid she had purchased weeks earlier, and poured the caustic liquid into a glass. Her movements were calm, deliberate, devoid of hesitation or visible emotion. She then returned to the bedroom, the glass clutched in her hand. She stood over the man she claimed to love, the man she had lived with for years, and calmly, purposefully woke him up. As Mark's eyes fluttered open, blinking away sleep, Wallace looked directly into his face. Her voice, devoid of any warmth or remorse, delivered a chilling pronouncement that would haunt investigators and Mark's family forever. "If I can't have you, no one can." Without a moment's hesitation, without a flicker of doubt, she threw the entire contents of the concentrated sulfuric acid directly onto Mark's face and upper body. The pain was beyond comprehension, instantaneous and apocalyptic. The acid, a highly corrosive substance, began dissolving his skin on contact, burning through multiple layers of tissue, muscle, and bone in a horrifying, irreversible process. The sensation was that of being consumed alive. Somehow, through unimaginable agony and primal instinct, Mark managed to stumble, to run from the flat, his body melting, his screams tearing through the night. He burst into the street, where neighbors, now fully awakened, found him in the horrific condition Dr. White had witnessed. The neighbors who came to Mark's aid were not just shocked, they were traumatized by what they saw. The acid had caused gruesome deep tissue burns over 25% of his body, grotesquely disfiguring most of his face, chest, shoulders, arms and legs. They quickly called emergency services, their voices trembling with disbelief and horror, and desperately tried to help Mark rinse off the acid with cold water. But the damage, tragically, was already catastrophic. The sulfuric acid, a powerful dehydrating agent, rapidly denatures proteins and lipids, causing liquefactive necrosis. Essentially, it turns living tissue into a liquid mass. Every second counted, and every second the acid remained, the damage deepened. When paramedics arrived, they found Mark in a state that seasoned medical professionals, accustomed to confronting the worst of human suffering, described as one of the worst they had ever encountered. He was foaming at the mouth, a terrifying physiological response to the extreme pain and shock. The chemical burns had already begun their irreversible destruction, obliterating his facial features. Most horrifically, in his unimaginable pain, Mark kept repeating a single heartbreaking phrase, "I can't see anything. I can't see." One of his irises, the colored part of his eye, had literally completely dissolved, leaving him blind in one eye and severely vision impaired in the other. Even in his incomprehensible agony, Mark's mind remained clear enough to identify his attacker. He repeatedly, through choked gasps of pain, told paramedics and police exactly who had done this to him. Berlinah Wallace. And then, his thoughts turning immediately to someone else, he begged them to check on his new girlfriend, terrified that Wallace, in her vengeful rage, might have attacked her as well. Police rushed to Wallace's flat, breaching the door with urgency. They found her sitting calmly on her sofa, almost serene, showing absolutely no emotion, no remorse, no sign of the monstrous act she had just committed. It was a chilling display of cold-blooded detachment. When Mark arrived at the hospital and, in a moment of devastating clarity, caught a glimpse of himself in a reflection, perhaps in a window or a polished surface, his reaction was heartbreaking. A guttural scream tore from his throat. He screamed that he no longer wanted to live, unable to comprehend the extent of his disfigurement, the terrifying reality of his new existence. The medical team, faced with the unimaginable horror of his injuries and his profound distress, had no choice but to place him in a medically induced coma. This wasn't a temporary measure. It was to last for 4 months, just to give his body a chance to begin the agonizing, arduous process of healing and to manage the excruciating pain. The acid, a virulent agent of destruction, continued its corrosive work even after the initial contact, eating through skin, muscle, and all the way down to Mark's bones. His injuries were so catastrophic that his left leg, irreparably damaged, had to be amputated. The sulfuric acid had dissolved the periosteum, the membrane around his bones, leaving them riddled with cavities and causing constant, unbearable neuropathic pain that no conventional painkiller could truly alleviate. His nose was completely destroyed, along with one of his ears, reducing his face to a horrifying, unrecognizable ruin. His life, as he knew it, had been obliterated. It took an agonizing 10 days for police to locate Mark's family in the Netherlands and deliver the shattering news of the attack. His father, Kees, a man who had always seen his son as strong and vibrant, immediately flew to Bristol. When he finally arrived at the hospital, the staff directed him to Mark's room. But when Kees looked around the ward, scanning the faces of the patients, he couldn't find his son anywhere. Confused, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach, he returned to the nurse's station, convinced they had made a mistake. They hadn't. The brutal truth was that Mark's injuries had rendered him so utterly unrecognizable, so profoundly disfigured, that even his own father couldn't identify him. Imagine the horror, the grief, the profound sense of loss in that moment. When Mark finally emerged from his coma 4 months later, the full, devastating extent of his losses became horrifyingly clear. He was paralyzed from the neck down, a prisoner in his own shattered body. For months, his only way to communicate was by using his tongue to point to letters on an alphabet board, a painstakingly slow and frustrating process. Through sheer force of will and extensive, grueling rehabilitation, he eventually regained the ability to speak, but his voice was strained and his speech labored. His independence, his career, his very identity, his life as he knew it, was over forever. He would require constant, specialized care for the rest of his abbreviated existence. The psychological trauma was every bit as devastating as the physical injuries. Mark fell into a profound and debilitating depression, struggling daily to accept the horrifying reality that he would need constant, intensive care for the rest of his life. His dignity was stripped away, his future erased. The police, making an extraordinary and rare decision, determined that photographs of Mark's injuries should never be released to the public, offering a grim indication of just how horrific his condition truly was, a testament to the depths of Wallace's cruelty. After more than a year of intensive medical treatment in the UK, a care home was finally found for Mark in Gloucester. But after just one night, a single, horrifying night, Mark called his father in desperation, his voice filled with despair, begging to be taken away. When Kees arrived, his heart broke once more. He found his beloved son covered in his own feces, clearly not receiving the basic care and dignity he deserved. Mark's family, understanding the urgency and the depth of his suffering, immediately arranged for private transport to bring him back to the Netherlands, their home, where they found him a facility with better, more compassionate care. Just when it seemed things couldn't possibly get worse, just when a semblance of stability had been achieved, Mark developed a severe lung infection. This required a tracheotomy, a tube to be permanently inserted into his throat, which would eliminate his ability to speak, the only meaningful connection he still had with his family, the last vestige of his independent communication. Faced with the unimaginable prospect of complete isolation, perpetual pain, and continued suffering without the ability to even utter a word, Mark made the most heart-wrenching, profound decision of his life. He chose to apply for euthanasia in Belgium, where the practice is legal under very strict conditions. His application, agonizingly reviewed by medical and ethical boards, was approved. On January 2nd, 2017, Mark spent his final day with his devoted father, sharing quiet moments, words of love, and a bittersweet farewell. At 7:15 p.m., at the age of just 29, Mark van Dongen died. The young man who had moved to the UK full of hope, ambition, and a radiant smile was gone. His life, brutally and irrevocably stolen, a victim of one of the most calculated, sadistic, and cruel attacks imaginable. The trial of Berlinah Wallace began in 2018 at Bristol Crown Court and became one of the most closely watched cases in British legal history. The prosecution, led by Adam Vitalingham QC, painted a horrifying picture of premeditation and malice. But Wallace's defense team, in a disturbing display of victim blaming, made several outrageous and utterly false arguments. They claimed that Mark himself had poured the acid into the glass, intending for Wallace to drink it, essentially accusing the victim of attempted murder, an accusation vehemently denied by all evidence and common sense. Furthermore, a significant legal hurdle emerged regarding Mark's death. The defense argued that since Mark had died through euthanasia, a conscious choice to end his suffering, rather than directly from the immediate effects of the acid attack, Wallace could not be held responsible for his murder. It was a complex and ethically charged argument. Prosecutor Adam Vitalingham QC directly addressed this crucial point to the jury, stating with powerful conviction, the physical and mental suffering that he sustained from that calculated acid attack were what drove him to euthanasia. Put simply, he could not bear to live in that condition. If that is right, we say, then she is guilty of murder. The prosecution argued that Mark's decision was a direct, foreseeable consequence of Wallace's actions, and therefore, she should be held accountable for his death. Wallace herself perpetuated additional false claims during the trial, further demonstrating her lack of remorse and twisted perception of reality. She accused Mark of being controlling and violent, accusations that were completely contradicted by every piece of evidence presented and every witness testimony. She even claimed she thought she was throwing water at Mark, not acid, a ludicrous assertion given the overwhelming evidence. She had meticulously researched acid attacks extensively, studying their devastating effects, and had even tested the acid's corrosive properties on a piece of furniture in her flat beforehand, proving she knew exactly what it would do. The evidence against Wallace was, in a word, overwhelming. Her internet search history was perhaps the most damning, revealing obsessive premeditation. She had delved into dozens of acid attack cases, demonstrating a clear and chilling understanding of the precise devastation she intended to inflict. The fact that she had tested the acid's strength before using it on Mark irrefutably proved she knew exactly how dangerous, how destructive it was. This was not a moment of irrational rage. It was a carefully plotted act of torture. The judge's sentencing remarks were utterly scathing, leaving no doubt as to the court's perception of Wallace's character and actions. She unequivocally called the attack premeditated, sadistic, malicious, and callous. She described Wallace herself as manipulative, controlling, and dangerous, a woman driven by a twisted sense of possessiveness and revenge. The judge stated directly, looking at Wallace, "Your intention was to burn, disfigure, and disable Mark so that he would no longer be attractive to any other woman. It was an act of pure evil." Even when faced with detailed, agonizing descriptions of Mark's suffering, both the physical torment and the profound psychological anguish, Wallace showed absolutely no remorse. She maintained her lies about Mark and about what had happened, never once acknowledging the devastating, irreversible pain she had caused, or expressing any regret for the life she had so cruelly destroyed. In the end, after a complex legal deliberation, Berlinah Wallace was cleared of murder. This decision, though legally sound given the specifics of causation in British law regarding euthanasia, was met with heartbreak and outrage by Mark's family and many observers. However, she was found guilty of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to endanger life, a charge that reflected the premeditated, horrific nature of her actions. She was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum of 12 years before being eligible for parole. A sentence that, for Mark's family, felt woefully inadequate compared to the life sentence of suffering they endured. The physical reminders of this horrific attack still exist today, etched into the very fabric of the street, where Mark van Dongen's life was irrevocably shattered. There are permanent acid burns on the doorbell that Mark frantically rang while desperately seeking help. The same corrosive acid that destroyed his body also corroded the metal, creating a chilling, silent, permanent memorial to that horrific morning, a testament to a young man's final, desperate struggle for survival. Mark's father, Keys, spoke eloquently and heartbreakingly about the lasting impact on their family, his words echoing the profound, perpetual grief they carried. "The sentence doesn't matter to us," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "because we as a family have been sentenced to life." They had not only lost Mark in the most brutal way imaginable, but they had been forced to watch him suffer for 15 agonizing months, witnessing his dignity erode before making the unbearable decision to end his pain, a decision no parent should ever have to make for their child. This case highlights with stark clarity the absolutely devastating nature of acid attacks, crimes that seem designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum, lifelong suffering and disfigurement. Unlike other forms of violence which might result in death or recovery, acid attacks create pervasive, lifelong disfigurement, chronic, unbearable pain, severe disability, and profound, enduring psychological trauma. The burns often require dozens of excruciating surgeries, cause severe mobility issues, and significantly increase the victim's risk of developing various forms of cancer years later. Victims frequently develop severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, debilitating depression, and crippling anxiety that haunt them forever, long after the physical wounds have closed. The premeditated nature of Wallace's attack makes it particularly horrifying, distinguishing it from spontaneous acts of violence. This wasn't a crime of passion, an impulsive act born of immediate rage. It was calculated torture, meticulously planned weeks in advance with the specific evil intention of destroying Mark's life in the cruelest, most agonizing way possible. She researched exactly what would happen to him, ordered the materials online, and even tested their effectiveness before carrying out her monstrous plan. Her calm demeanor before and after the attack further underscores the chilling premeditation. Acid attacks often stem from deep-seated jealousy, a desire for revenge, or critically, an inability to accept rejection. They are frequently used in domestic violence situations, especially when one partner, often the abuser, cannot accept the end of a relationship, viewing their partner as property rather than an individual. Wallace's case is a textbook example of this horrifying dynamic. When Mark bravely tried to leave and start a new life, Wallace chose to brutally destroy him rather than let him go, rather than face her own abandonment. It was an act of ultimate control and malicious possessiveness. The legal complexities surrounding Mark's euthanasia also raise important and difficult questions about causation in criminal law. While Wallace wasn't convicted of murder, many legal experts and ethicists argue vehemently that her actions directly led to Mark's death, that the euthanasia was simply the final, unavoidable step in a process of unbearable suffering that she set in motion with her calculated, brutal acid attack. The question remains, should attackers face murder charges when their actions directly lead to a victim's decision to end their suffering, their only escape from a life of unimaginable torment? This case serves as a stark, horrifying reminder of how one person's jealousy, their inability to accept rejection, and their manipulative control can not only destroy one life, but devastate multiple lives forever. If you found this deep dive into the psychological and legal complexities of the Bristol Nightmare compelling, please subscribe for more true crime analyses that explore criminal psychology and the pursuit of justice. And remember, the warning signs of dangerous, abusive relationships are often visible long before tragedy strikes. Mark's friends saw the abuse, heard the threats, witnessed the escalating violence. Sometimes the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when the victim finally finds the courage to leave. Let Mark's story be a grim reminder to always recognize those signs, to reach out for help, and to protect yourself and those you love from such profound darkness.